He'd been watching over priceless artifacts for 10 years, standing guard in marble halls, making sure visitors didn't touch ancient treasures. Just another elderly security guard earning modest wages protecting things he couldn't afford to own. Until international art thieves targeted the museum's most valuable pieces. And suddenly the quiet guard revealed why he recognized forgeries the curators had missed. Albert Edward Hastings was 74 years old, with silver gray hair combed neatly to one side and sharp gray eyes that seemed to catalog every visitor who entered his galleries. His compact frame remained erect despite his age, and his weathered hands bore the careful scars of someone who had spent decades brushing dirt from ancient pottery and handling artifacts that connected the modern world to civilizations lost in time. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue this incredible tale of hidden expertise and protective dedication, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories about quiet guardians deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. The Metropolitan Museum of Ancient Arts occupied a magnificent Beaux Arts building in Philadelphia's Cultural District, housing one of the world's most comprehensive collections of archaeological treasures spanning 5 millennia of human achievement. Greek marble sculptures that had adorned temples to forgotten gods, Roman mosaics that had decorated imperial palaces, Egyptian sarcophagi that had protected pharaohs through eternity, and Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets that contained humanity's earliest written laws. Albert worked the evening shift, 4 p.m. to midnight, patrolling designated routes through galleries where tourists photographed artifacts they would never truly comprehend, and school groups received simplified explanations of discoveries that had required decades of scholarly research to understand properly. His uniform was standard museum security, navy blazer with museum insignia, comfortable walking shoes for marble floors, two-way radio for coordination with other guards, and the quiet authority that convinced visitors to respect boundaries without creating uncomfortable confrontations. The museum staff treated Albert with the courteous respect reserved for dependable service personnel. Curators appreciated that he maintained vigilant protection of collections while never interfering with their academic work. Exhibition designers knew they could rely on his observations about crowd flow and visitor behavior. Security supervisors valued his impeccable attendance record and professional competence that required minimal oversight. What none of them realized was that Dr. Albert Edward Hastings understood the historical significance of every artifact in their collections better than most of the curators who studied them. Albert lived alone in a modest apartment 15 minutes from the museum, a comfortable 2-bedroom unit in an older building that attracted academics and professionals who prioritized location over luxury. The main living areas were furnished simply but tastefully, decorated with carefully selected reproductions of ancient art that reflected deep appreciation for historical craftsmanship, without revealing the expertise behind those choices. But the second bedroom told the story of a life devoted to uncovering humanity's buried past. The walls displayed professional photographs from archaeological expeditions across 4 decades. Excavation sites in Egypt, where he'd spent months uncovering intact tomb complexes. Greek islands, where he documented Bronze Age settlements that rewrote understanding of ancient trade networks. Mesopotamian tales, where his team had unearthed urban centers that predated written history. And remote locations in Turkey, where he discovered artifacts that bridged civilizations separated by thousands of years. Bookshelves held academic journals in 7 languages, technical references for dating archaeological materials, authentication guides for identifying forgeries, and bound volumes of his own published research that had established him as one of the world's leading experts in ancient Mediterranean archaeology and art crime investigation. And in a fireproof filing cabinet, secured with locks that most people would find excessive for an apartment, were documents that would have revolutionized how the museum treated their evening security guard. A PhD in classical archaeology from Harvard University, postdoctoral fellowships from Oxford and the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, consulting credentials with Interpol's art crime team, and authentication certificates that major auction houses had relied upon for decades. Dr. Albert Edward Hastings, internationally recognized authority on ancient Mediterranean civilizations and one of the world's most foremost experts in detecting archaeological forgeries. His academic career had spanned 42 years, during which he led excavations that made headlines in National Geographic, consulted with law enforcement agencies on art theft cases worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and trained museum professionals in authentication techniques that protected collections from sophisticated forgery operations. His specialty had been the intersection of archaeology and criminal investigation. Understanding how ancient craftsmen had worked, what materials and techniques they'd used, and how authentic artifacts differed from modern reproductions that flooded illegal international art markets. Albert could examine a piece and determine not only whether it was authentic, but often identify the specific workshop where it had been created, the approximate date of manufacture, and whether it had been legally excavated or stolen from archaeological sites. The career had taken Albert to excavation sites on every continent, academic conferences where his research shaped understanding of ancient civilizations, and crime scenes where artifacts represented cultural heritage lost to criminal networks that treated history as a commodity to be bought and sold. But forced retirement in 2014 due to budget cuts had ended his access to the fieldwork and meaningful research that had defined his adult existence. At 64, he'd found himself with a pension that provided basic security, but without the purpose and intellectual stimulation that had driven him since graduate school. The security position at the Metropolitan Museum wasn't about financial necessity. His retirement income covered essential expenses. It was about staying connected to the artifacts and historical periods that had been his life's work, maintaining daily contact with objects that represented humanity's greatest artistic achievements, and continuing to protect cultural heritage, even if his role had changed from scholar to guard. The work also allowed Albert to continue practicing skills that academic retirement couldn't eliminate. Walking through galleries filled with authentic ancient artifacts, he noticed details that escaped both casual visitors and many professional staff members. Subtle inconsistencies in craftsmanship that suggested restoration work. Provenance questions raised by pieces that seemed too perfect for their alleged age, and authentication concerns about objects whose documentation didn't match their physical characteristics. Over 10 years of evening shifts, Albert had quietly identified dozens of potential problems with museum acquisitions, always couching his observations in language that wouldn't threaten curatorial authority or suggest that a security guard was questioning professional expertise. Dr. Mitchell, that new Greek red figure vase in Gallery 7, the paint composition seems unusual for 5th century attic work. Interesting observation, Albert. We'll take conservation to take another look at it. These diplomatic suggestions had prevented several major embarrassments when authentication proved Albert's concerns were justified. But the museum's organizational hierarchy meant his expertise remained invisible to everyone except the few staff members who had learned to trust his intuitive observations about ancient art. Wednesday, March 8th, started like every other evening shift. Albert arrived at 3:50 p.m., checked in with day shift security, and began his routine patrol through galleries that housed civilizations he'd spent decades studying. The museum was moderately busy for a weekday. Art students sketching classical sculptures, tourists following audio guides through Egyptian collections, and the usual mix of academics and enthusiasts that comprised Philadelphia's museum-going community. At 8:45 p.m., while conducting his regular security round through the Greek and Roman galleries, Albert noticed something that triggered every instinct developed during 42 years of archaeological investigation. The museum's prize acquisition, a recently purchased 2nd century Roman marble portrait bust valued at over $3 million, looked wrong in ways that would be invisible to casual observers but were unmistakable to someone with his background. The surface patination, which should have reflected 2,000 years of aging, showed inconsistencies that suggested artificial treatment. The marble itself, allegedly from quarries near Rome, contained mineral inclusions that Albert recognized from much later historical periods. Most concerning of all, The sculptor's technique revealed tool marks characteristic of modern carving equipment rather than ancient Roman chisels. Albert had seen thousands of similar pieces during his academic career, both authentic artifacts recovered from legitimate excavations and sophisticated forgeries created by criminal networks that specialized in deceiving even expert authentication procedures. This piece was almost certainly a fake. But Albert's position as evening security guard provided no formal authority to question acquisitions that had been approved by curators with advanced degrees and authentication processes that involved multiple layers of scholarly review.
He documented his observations through photographs taken during routine security rounds, noted details that supported his concerns, and prepared to file a report through appropriate channels that would protect both his position and the museum's reputation, while ensuring that potential problems received proper investigation. At 8:45 p.m., Albert's concerns escalated from scholarly authentication questions to active criminal investigation. While patrolling the museum's administrative areas, he observed activities that had nothing to do with normal educational operations. 3 individuals were conducting what appeared to be detailed photographic documentation of specific high-value artifacts, using professional equipment that suggested commercial rather than academic purposes. Albert recognized the behavioral patterns from his consulting work with art crime investigators. These weren't researchers or journalists conducting legitimate scholarly work. They were professionals gathering intelligence for criminal operations that required precise knowledge of security systems, artifact locations, and authentication procedures. He observed them for 20 minutes, noting license plates, photographic equipment, and conversation fragments that confirmed his worst suspicions. They were discussing replacement schedules, authentication windows, and market timing in ways that indicated sophisticated art fraud rather than legitimate academic research. Dr. Hastings had encountered similar operations during his consulting work with international law enforcement agencies. Criminal networks that replaced authentic museum pieces with high-quality forgeries, selling originals on black markets while leaving institutions displaying fake artifacts for months or years before the substitutions were discovered. The authentication expertise, access to museum facilities, and market knowledge required for such operations indicated criminal organizations with resources that exceeded casual art theft. These were professionals who understood both archaeological authentication and museum security procedures well enough to execute crimes that might go undetected for decades. Albert needed to report his observations to appropriate authorities, but doing so would require explaining how a museum security guard possessed the expertise to identify sophisticated art fraud operations that had escaped detection by professional curators and authentication specialists. Dr. Albert Hastings faced a choice that would define the remainder of his career. He could file routine incident reports through museum security channels, hope that supervisors would take seriously the concerns of an elderly guard whose observations seemed to exceed his job qualifications, and risk allowing criminal operations to proceed while bureaucratic processes slowly addressed his warnings. Or he could use 4 decades of expertise in archaeological crime investigation to protect cultural heritage the way he'd been trained to do when similar threats emerged during his academic career. Dr. Hastings made his decision in approximately 30 seconds. He activated security protocols he'd helped design during consulting work with museum protection systems, contacted law enforcement agencies through professional networks that retained his credentials even in retirement, and began implementing countermeasures against art fraud operations using expertise that criminal organizations never suspected existed in elderly security guards. At 9:30 p.m., Albert was coordinating with FBI art crime team agents who had arrived to investigate what could potentially be the largest museum fraud operation in American history. Dr. Hastings, how did you identify the authentication problems that our initial investigation missed? Special Agent Rebecca Chen asked during the briefing. Albert adjusted his security guard uniform, straightened his museum ID badge, and provided the kind of professional analysis that had made him legendary among archaeological crime investigators. Agent Chen, I've spent 42 years studying exactly these kinds of artifacts and authentication procedures. The Roman portrait bust in Gallery 12 shows tool marks and material characteristics consistent with modern forgery techniques I've encountered in previous investigations. The individuals conducting surveillance this evening were gathering intelligence for replacement operations that would substitute authentic pieces with sophisticated reproductions. The transformation was instantaneous. The elderly museum guard disappeared, replaced by one of the world's leading experts in archaeological crime investigation. The authentication documents for recent acquisitions show patterns consistent with fraudulent provenance that I recognized from similar cases during my consulting work with international law enforcement agencies. We're dealing with criminal organizations that have infiltrated museum acquisition procedures at multiple levels. Over the next 6 hours, Dr. Hastings worked alongside federal agents to expose an art fraud network that had been operating for over 3 years, replacing authentic artifacts with forgeries while selling originals to private collectors who never asked uncomfortable questions about provenance. Laboratory analysis confirmed that 7 major museum acquisitions were sophisticated fakes, representing over $20 million in fraudulent transactions that would have gone undetected without Albert's expertise. Dr. Hastings, why didn't you inform museum administration about your professional background when you were hired? Director Patricia Adams asked during the emergency meeting. Albert looked around the conference room filled with curators, administrators, and law enforcement officials who had treated him as invisible service personnel for 10 years. Ma'am, I was hired to provide security services, not archaeological consultation. But when criminal activities threaten cultural heritage, professional obligations take precedence over job descriptions. The story made international headlines in archaeology and museum publications, but Albert didn't seek publicity or career advancement from his role in exposing the fraud network. He accepted the museum's offer to serve as senior authentication consultant while continuing evening security duties, ensuring that his expertise protected collections through both scholarly analysis and practical vigilance. Because he'd learned that the most effective protection often comes from people whose knowledge exceeds their official titles, whose dedication continues regardless of recognition, and whose expertise serves cultural heritage whether or not anyone realizes they possess it. Dr. Hastings continued working at the museum until he was 81 years old, training younger staff in authentication techniques while maintaining the security procedures that had protected irreplaceable artifacts for over a decade. Because true expertise doesn't announce itself with credentials or demand recognition through titles. It simply goes about the quiet business of preserving human history, one artifact at a time.